Good morning, everyone. If you're watching this as a recording, then I apologize for the fact that the internet was not good enough for me to speak to you personally, preach to you live, as it were. But anyway, that's the way it is. For our scripture reading, I just want a short passage from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus said, "The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And now one greater than Jonah is here." A sad thought. And then for the children's story, we all know what IKEA is. We've probably bought things there, and we all know what their speciality is, which is flat pack furniture. And when you get it home, you open all those cardboard boxes and you hunt through and hope you have all the right screws and fastenings and hinges and knobs and all the rest of it. And then you get busy with the screwdriver and an Allen key, and sometime later, a long time later, you have a piece of furniture that is useful, may even be attractive. There you go. Well, you know, in Britain from time to time we have snowstorms. And you also know that everyone grumbles bitterly about the snow. The difficulty in driving, walking, how cold it is, all that sort of thing. But just remember, God is sending you IKEA snowmen, because all God's snowmen come disassembled, and it's up to you to put them together. In other words, you can view snow as either a curse or as an opportunity for fun. Even if you're not into snowmen, or you feel you're too old for making snow angels and having snowball fights, just look around you at how beautiful the world is, suddenly changed to white, pure, pristine white. Doesn't last, of course, but there you go. And remember the couplet my mother always used to quote: "Two men looked out through prison bars. The one saw mud, the other stars." And remember, to see the stars, you have to be looking up. There we go, that's our thought for the day. The reluctant prophet, obviously you can guess who that is, Jonah. I don't propose to be teaching you anything new about the theological or devotional impact of the story of Jonah, but I do hope that I can do a bit to put him in his context. The book of Jonah begins with a very simple statement: "The word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai." And incidentally, that bit over on the left of the screen comes from a Pictish cross in Fowlis Westerchurch in Perthshire. And on the right, according to the signboard, it shows Jonah being swallowed by a whale. But from the fact that on the left you have a sword and another monster, I can't help but wonder if in fact the reference is to Beowulf. But there you go. We'll take what the experts say. It's Jonah being swallowed by the whale. The very first mention of Jonah in the Bible is in the historical record of the kings of Judah, and we are told that Jonah predicted the success of Jeroboam, who was the second king of that name, Jeroboam II. And it's reasonable to presume that Jonah lived during or shortly before the reign of this Jeroboam. He came from a place called Gath-Hepher, which is a small village a few miles northwest from Nazareth, and there is a mosque there. I'm not sure whether it's intended to mark his birthplace or his grave, Nabi Yunus. There is, of course, a more famous Nabi Yunus over in Mosul, but there you go. The mosque has only recently had the domes gilded, so presumably the Palestinians are feeling a bit flush with money at the moment. Jeroboam was a strong ruler. He wasn't necessarily a good ruler, not a godly ruler, but he was a strong ruler, and during his reign Israel was more prosperous than ever before. The dates for his reign are 782 to 753 BC. Partly he was a good ruler, but mainly the success of his reign is due to the fact that Assyria was weak at the time. These are the ruins of what may be the palace of the kings of Israel in Samaria. Towards the end of his reign, in 760 BC, the whole of Palestine was shaken by a massive earthquake which may have been as much as 8.2 on the Richter scale to judge by its effects. Certainly it made a deep impression on people at the time. Amos dated his vision to 2 years before the earthquake in the days of Jeroboam. And even 3.5 centuries later, the prophet Zechariah referred to that same earthquake as something that people still remembered vividly, as an illustration of sheer terror. So in other words, the impact of the earthquake was still felt 350 years later. That's pretty impressive. Now, I mentioned that Assyria was weak. During the reign of Jeroboam, you had 2 kings in Syria that almost exactly matched his own reign: Shalmaneser IV and Ashur-dan III. They ruled in, well, not actually in Nineveh, in another city a bit to the south of Nineveh, but of course they ruled over Nineveh. The real power, however, was held by the nobles and by an army general called Shamshi-Ilu. During the reign of Ashur-dan, 7 years after he came to power, Assyria was hit by a severe plague, and it was so badly affected that there was no military campaign that year. Now, that was more or less a religious responsibility, to go out and conquer the world for Ashur, the god. So the fact that there was no campaign shows you how badly the nation was affected by this plague. And it seems to me likely that this plague is what triggered off Jonah's mission, because it would have predisposed the people of Nineveh to listening to him and paying attention to what he said. However, there is another possibility, because in 787 BC, Adad-nirari III, that's the first of these kings, he erected a temple in Nineveh to Nabu of Borsippa. Borsippa is a place near Babylon, and he decreed that Nabu was the chief, or maybe even the only god, and that people should worship only him. And it was a religious revolution similar to that of Akhenaten in Egypt. It didn't last, but during that time, Nabu, the god who invented writing and who was the scribe of the gods, and therefore who assigned men their fates, was given unusual prominence. And in fact, one statue of Nabu from this period bears an inscription, "Trust in Nabu, not in any other god." Could this be attributed to Jonah's preaching? With the plague 22 years later, a punishment for returning to the old gods and the old ways. It's tempting to link it with that, but if that was so, why did they settle on Nabu instead of worshipping Jonah's God, who had sent them the warning? Well, there you go, you take your pick. But whatever, it was around about this time. Mind you, Adad-nirari did destroy Damascus, Israel's longtime rival and enemy, and that paved the way for Jeroboam's prosperity and power, as well as the fact that the Assyrian kings were weak, so he didn't have any enemies either abroad or at home. He was very fortunate. So the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, son of Amittai, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." If this was because of the plague, then it was important that Jonah go right away. Leave it a year, and the impact of the plague would have lessened, would have vanished, and his mission would have been in vain. Unfortunately, the mere thought of going to Nineveh gave Jonah the willies. The people of Nineveh, the Assyrians, were renowned for their cruelty. Jonah didn't want a bar of this. He decided to go as far as he could in the opposite direction. So he went down to Joppa. Now, he could just as easily have gone north to Tyre and got a Phoenician ship, but perhaps he didn't want to sail with heathen. So he went down to Joppa, hoping there to get onto a Israelite ship, or a Judean ship. It's about 55 miles as the crow flies, but of course he would have gone in a slightly different route. He wouldn't have gone direct because there are mountains in the way. So he went down there, and what he found was, this. That promontory that you see in the distance is Joppa, and the bays on either side of it are completely devoid of any shelter. Those groins and breakwaters that you see offshore are all modern. There are some rocks offshore, but they don't really provide any shelter. They're more a danger to shipping than anything else. Josephus remarks that Joppa is not naturally a haven, for it ends in a rough shore. And then he mentions the great stones jut out into the sea, where the chains wherewith Andromeda was bound have left their marks, which attest to the antiquity of that fable. Andromeda was rescued by Perseus and is probably the origin of George and the Dragon. But there you go. Now here you have an old engraving, and you can see over on the right the waves breaking over the rocks. Here's another engraving. Again, you can see the waves breaking on the rocks. And the result was that ships could not actually come to shore. Even in modern times, I have a rather old book showing a modern steamer being unloaded into little boats where the passengers were ferried to the shore, and as often as not they would be upset in the waves. So landing at Joppa or taking off from Joppa was always a bit of a fraught business. So we know exactly where Joppa was, but there's no such certainty about Tarshish. In Cagliari in Sardinia there is this stone in the museum which has been interpreted as confirming that Tarshish was on the island of Sardinia. But it sounds rather to me as though it's saying Tarshish was not in Sardinia, because it just says from Tarshish he was driven. We don't know who he was. And in Sardinia he found refuge, which would be an odd thing if Tarshish was in Sardinia. And we don't know who any of these people were anyway, but there you go. Some versions of the Septuagint, instead of saying that Jonah wanted to go to Carthage, say that he wanted to go to Carchedun, which is Carthage. Now, Carthage is on the coast of North Africa, near the modern city of Tunis. In the days of Jonah, it was a huge city. It still hadn't been conquered by the Romans, who didn't even exist by then. It was the head of a trading empire that extended all the way from Lebanon to Spain and even to Cornwall, where they traded for tin. Mind you, if Jonah were heading for somewhere beyond Carthage, his ship probably still would have called in at Carthage. You know, it was sort of the central port for all trade in the Mediterranean. The Romans destroyed Carthage pretty thoroughly, and there's not much left of its ruins. So some have suggested that Tarsus was actually Cadiz, or a Carthaginian settlement near Cadiz, which has an excellent harbour. But, you know, we just don't know. We don't have any inscriptional evidence saying where Tarshish was. All we can be sure is that it was a long way away. Jonah didn't want to be anywhere near Nineveh. So, whichever it was about as far away as Jonah could imagine. Now, he got on board a ship. Here you have a depiction of a Phoenician ship. And the interesting thing is, you can see it's got a bank of oars, but there's no sign of a mast or a sail. Okay? So, Phoenician ships, Carthaginian ships, were the ones most likely to trade to points beyond. So it was almost certainly a Carthaginian ship. But these Tarshish ships, they're mentioned several times in the Bible. Solomon had a fleet of Tarshish ships. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish. Now, what does it mean? Ships from Tarshish? Well, not if Solomon owned them. So more likely a Tarshish ship is a type of ship, perhaps particularly big, perhaps particularly fast. Jehoshaphat agreed with Ahaziah to construct a fleet of ships of Tarshish, and these were built at Etzion-Geber. Now, we're not exactly sure where Etzion-Geber is, but there is some slight archaeological evidence that this island, known as Jazirat al-Farun, not far from Aqaba in the Gulf of Aqaba, is that, and this little bay that you can see down here is the, there we go, that is where Solomon built his ships, and where they were eventually wrecked, because God said, you've made an alliance with Ahaziah, the king of Israel, and so Yahweh will destroy what you have made, and the ships were wrecked and were not able to sail to Tarshish. The psalmist is very clear that they are ships of Tarshish, not ships going to Tarshish. So I suspect that rather like back in the days of sail, you might speak of a China clipper, which was a fast sailing ship, whether or not it was going to China, whether or not it was transporting tea. So in the same way you would speak of a ship of Tarshish, meaning a particular style of ship, a particular type of ship, a particular size of ship. So Jonah went down to Tarshish, where he found a ship bound for the port, and after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from Yahweh, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to think of doing, when you find later on that he admits that he knows that Yahweh created heaven and earth. So I don't think Tarshish is down south from Israel. I don't think it's land of Punt. I think it must be somewhere to the west. Now Yahweh sent a great wind on the sea. We're not told how far the ship had gone before the storm struck, though the implication is that it was fairly near the beginning of the voyage. Now if the ship was rowed by oars, then very likely it would have followed the route shown on the map in purple, because that was the shortest way to Carthage, to go along the coast and perhaps make a dash across the Gulf of Syrtis, but you'd keep fairly close to the coast. However, if it was a sailing ship, then it would have followed the route shown in red, because the winds were contrary. The grain ships in Roman times could sail from Rome to Alexandria in about a week, but it took them 3 months to get back again, because they had to go north and beat against the wind, relying upon the coast, the shore breezes, to make any progress. If it was this latter case, then Jonah ended up closer to Nineveh than when he'd started. There you go. Well, in this storm, all the sailors were afraid. Each cried out to his own God. They threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Why? I suspect because he was seasick. And when you're seasick, let me tell you, the only thing you are afraid of is that the ship will not sink, because death would be a sweet relief. I suffer from seasickness. I know what I'm talking about. They prayed to their own gods. It wasn't much use praying to the goddess of love or the god of war, but even so, you were spoiled for choice. Over on the left you have Teshub, the Syrian storm god. In the middle you have Tarhunzas, the Hittite storm god. On the right you have Arpad, the Mesopotamian storm god. So wherever these traders and sailors came from, they had gods they could choose. And of course there was always the Phoenician favorite, the one that the Phoenician sailors worshipped. That was Baal the Thunderer, the god who controlled the weather. Well, this storm was so sudden, so dramatic, so terrible that the sailors believed it was supernatural. But Jonah, who knew nothing about the sea, was just keeping out away below decks and trying to keep dry. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he'll take notice of us and we will not perish." That would have given Jonah a nasty start. The sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." If that is their normal custom whenever there was a storm, one shudders to think how many innocent people were thrown overboard, or sacrificed, or paid a fine, or whatever. But in this case, the lots fell on the guilty man. The lots fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? From what people are you?" Either because they trusted the dice implicitly, or because there was some reaction when the dice fell to Jonah, which convinced them that he was the guilty one. And so Jonah said, "Well, I'm a Hebrew, and I worship Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. How can you escape from the God who made sea and land and everything else?" It's interesting that he didn't try to hide the God he worshipped. No messing around with storm god underlings or anything like that. Ea, or Yah, the creator god, and he stood pretty high in the heathen pantheons. He wasn't the top god, but he was, up near the top. And this terrified them. They asked, "What have you done?" I gather it was a rhetorical question, because they already knew that he was running away from Yahweh. I don't know when he told them that, whether it was soon after he boarded, or whether it was when the lots were cast, or what. Jonah said, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know it's my fault that this great storm has come on you." I wonder how Jonah felt as he said that, because, of course, it was a death sentence. He probably couldn't swim coming from an inland town, but even if he could, so far from land, it was hopeless. There was no way. And to their credit, these sailors didn't just pick him up immediately and sling him overboard. They did their best to row back to land. Notice, row back to land, not try to sail back to land. Either they didn't have a mast and sail, or the wind was too strong and they had put it down. They'd pulled it down. Whatever it was, they tried to row, but not a hope. And rowing in a storm is not very easy, because as the ship rocks from side to side, at one moment your oars are dug deep into the water, the next moment they miss the water completely. So it's not terribly effective. And finally, the sailors gave it up as a bad job. They cried to Yahweh, "Oh Yahweh, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Yahweh, have done as you pleased." I think these sailors come out of it pretty well, actually, but there you go. So they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and immediately the storm stopped, which made them greatly fear Yahweh, and they offered a sacrifice to him, made vows to him. And you may wonder how we know this. How did Jonah know this in order to put it in his book? Well, I think the answer is very simple. When they got back to Joppa, whenever that was, the first thing they said was, "Boy, you'll never guess what happened to us. We picked up a passenger here. We're not doing that again, I can tell you." And they told the story. Well, the Bible says that Yahweh provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. When it says Yahweh provided, it may mean he's specially created. So it's no good looking at fish these days and trying to say, well, was it an overgrown tuna or something like that? It's interesting that this Muslim manuscript has the picture more accurately than most European tellings of the story, because it wasn't a whale. It was a great fish. And the idea that it was a whale is an invention of Western storytellers. Mind you, the idea dies hard. Here in the middle of Joppa is a statue created by some modern artist as a tribute to Jonah, who set sail from Joppa. There you go. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed. He didn't seem too willing to pray outside the fish. He knew that he had offended against God. He didn't feel that he could ask God for help when he was in trouble. But now that he had paid the price, as it were, he felt able to pray to God. I hope that none of us are like that. When we do wrong, turn to God immediately. Don't wait for God's judgment to fall on you before you pray to him. Turn to God immediately. And Jonah said, "In my distress I called to Yahweh, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help." The word is actually from the depths of Sheol, from the underworld. "And you listened to my cry." I imagine that down there in the fish's belly, Jonah did indeed feel that he was in the underworld. And then he says, "I, with the song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you, and what I have vowed I will make good." I wonder what he vowed. I imagine it included reference to Nineveh. Well, Yahweh commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto dry land. According to tradition, this is the area where Jonah was vomited out onto dry land. It's called Juni, or Junia. It's just north of Beirut. This is what it looked like in 1950, when it was still a very pleasant area to go to get away from the bustle and rush of Beirut and spend a pleasant time by the seaside. This is what it looks like now. Basically, it's just a suburb of Beirut. Incidentally, this picture is taken from up here, which I always knew as Stella Maris, but apparently the proper name is Our Lady of Lebanon. You can get a cable car up to it, but driving is also possible. Just the problem is there's no parking at the top. And these days, the skyline, instead of being dominated by this huge statue of Mary, is dominated by this rather ghastly modern cathedral. I haven't seen it, but it looks a bit of an eyesore. There you go. So that's where Jonah was cast ashore, a bit closer to Nineveh than when he started. So the word of Yahweh came to Jonah a second time. I don't know why Jonah didn't set off for Nineveh as soon as his feet hit dry land. Maybe he needed a bit of time to recuperate. Maybe he was still reluctant to go. But the word was, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." And so Jonah set off. He wasn't keen to see the inside of a whale again. Jonah obeyed the word of Yahweh and went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a very important city. A visit required 3 days, which we're not sure what that means. It literally says it was a 3 days journey. Now, this is the city of Nineveh on Google Earth, and you can still see the walls. Can you see them here? They are big. They're about 7 miles around. So it is a very impressive city, but even so, it's only 2.85 miles from north to south and 1.35 miles at its widest. So that's hardly a 3 days journey. If you look closer, you can see how packed the place is with houses and streets and dwellings. So some have suggested that the 3 days journey was walking up and down every street in Nineveh. Now that's possible. I know that I once spent a whole day walking up and down every single street in Jerusalem, which is a much smaller city than Nineveh. So yes, that's possible. But there is another possibility, and that is that a short distance to the south, about 30 miles to the south, you have the city of Kala, which was the capital city. Here it is. Now I'm just roughly outlining the walls of the place there, and then there's a deviation around the ziggurat of Kala, and up there, unfortunately, ISIS destroyed most of Kala with bulldozers and dynamite when they were there. But this was the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the time. It wasn't for another 30 years that Nineveh was made the capital city. So is it possible that the area in between was so heavily built up that Jonah just thought, that the whole thing is one city, and he wandered from Nineveh to Kala and from Kala back to Nineveh and thought he was just walking around the one city? I don't know. There is another city which was important, but it is so much further south, 60 miles from Nineveh and on the other side of the river, so I don't think that's got anything to do with this, the city of Ashur. Well, on the first day that Jonah started into the city, he began shouting out, 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. I wonder where that 40 came from. That's the first mention of it. Did God give Jonah that message? Or was Jonah just, picking up 40 days in the hope that, 40 days would give him time to proclaim his message and be in the clear before judgment came, or before judgment didn't come and he was accused of being a false prophet? But the interesting thing is that immediately the people of Nineveh believed God, and they declared a fast, the city authorities, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth, even the king of Nineveh. Now it says when the news reached the king of Nineveh, which may indicate that he was down in Kala, and it took time for the news to get down to him, but he too rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, sat down in the dust. After the terrible plague, the people of Nineveh were not about to offend any god, and particularly not Ea. And there was a particular reason for that. You see, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decided to destroy mankind because mankind had become as numerous as flies, and the noise they were making kept the gods awake. And so they decided to wipe mankind out. And it was Enki who very kindly came down and warned one man, this is what you need to do, build a boat, and that way you'll escape the coming disaster. The Assyrian name for Enki was Ea, or Yah. So when Jonah walked through the city saying, yet 40 days and Yah will destroy this place, the people thought, boy, this is a message from Enki, from Ea. This is something we had better listen to. Utnapishtim listened, built the boat, and he was safe. What have we got to do in order to be safe? And Jonah's message made a tremendous impact on the people of Nineveh. In fact, the king even took things to the extreme. He said, not even man or beast, herd or flock must eat. Do not let them eat or drink. They must all wear sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger, so that we will not perish. And it worked. God did not destroy Nineveh. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion. Now, this is completely in harmony with God's policy. a few years later, he told Jeremiah, look, if at any time I announced that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down, destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I planned. And mind you, the converse is also true. If at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be blessed, to be built up and planted, if it then does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do it. Okay, and Ellen White says, it's true that time has continued longer than we expected in the early days of this message. Our Saviour did not appear as soon as we hoped, but has the word of the Lord failed? Never. It should be remembered that the promises and threatenings of God are alike conditional. So what God says depends upon our response to it, or rather what God does depends on our response to what he says. But Jonah, most evangelists would be delighted if they could convert a whole city. Jonah was furious. He prayed to Yahweh, oh Yahweh, is not this what I said when I was still at home? That's why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I don't think so. I think he just went to Tarshish because he was scared of going to Nineveh. But anyway, I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God. Now, O Yahweh, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than to live. If only Jonah had been a better man. If only he'd stayed there and set up Bible classes. If only he'd taught the people what they should do, how they should worship God. You know, what a difference it could have made in history, instead of which he went on a massive sulk. And you know, I've known people who behave the same way. When God doesn't do what they want, they reject him, they turn their back on him. God doesn't answer their prayers in the way they want. Never going to pray again. I've even had someone whose whose wife died of old age. You know, wasn't that she died young or anything like that. Died of old age, and he became bitter against God. How ridiculous. Well, Jonah headed for the nearest hills, which are about 13 miles away. He was taking no chances as he waited and hoped for disaster to fall on Nineveh. Jonah's primary concern seems to be his reputation. He wanted 5 stars. He wanted lots of likes. But you know, he had the wrong ideas about success. There are people today for whom success means personal kudos, for being recognized, for being famous. Wealth and power follow those whose predictions come true. But in God's eyes, success is none of those things. Success means sinners changed and saved, even if they are the hated Assyrians. Well, we all know what happened next. Jonah sat under sat on these hills, and a vine grew up and provided shade for him. And then the next day the vine died, and Jonah was angrier than ever. And you can imagine that on these hot, bare hills a bit of shade would indeed be gratefully received, and sorely missed when it was gone. And Yahweh did his best to get Jonah's priorities right. Look, you've been concerned about this vine. You didn't tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight. It died overnight. But look, Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left. And many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? Now, some people have tried to use that number to estimate the population of Nineveh. They say, oh, you know, right hand from left means they're babies. So if there's 120,000 babies, and there must be so many thousand people, yeah, that's missing the point. Whether it's babies or people who are innocent and don't really know what is right and wrong is irrelevant. The point is that Nineveh was a great city, and God loved it. And he loved the animals in it. That would have been a new thought for Jonah. They might have been cruel, they might have been wicked, they might have been well-deserving punishment, but God still loved them. Jonah's reputation didn't matter. Saving souls did. You know, in the heart of Moscow you have this building, St. Basil's Cathedral. But very few people in the West know who St. Basil was. He lived 1458 to 1557. He became known as the Holy Fool, because he went around wearing a great big chain. He went naked even in winter. But he was the only one who dared to rebuke Ivan the Terrible to his face. Think on that. Do we ever hold back from witnessing because we're afraid of what people will think of us or what they might do to us. Perhaps we need to be more like St. Basil and less like Jonah, less concerned about reputation, less concerned about what people will think of us, and more ready to speak God's words to those about us. Shall we bow our heads? And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus, and the close friendship of the Holy Spirit be with us all till he come. Amen.